Hello and welcome. Today we will be demonstrating the Ward Science 3D floodplain model. My name is Lynn Welch. I'm the State Floodplain Management Officer here at the State Emergency Management Agency. So you might be asking yourself, why is floodplain management important? Many of Americans do not know that the risk that they take by building and developing within a floodplain, as well as the astounding effects that it might have when a rain event comes through a floodplain. So today we will be covering that. Some of the benefits of a floodplain are the natural and beneficial functions. So with that, it is generally associated with wetlands. A wetland, as we demonstrate here, is nature's sponge associated with actual sponges here. When water comes in from a rain event, it will slowly suck in all the water and hold it until it gets to a certain level and then slowly release it down Walker's Creek. Once the water is also in the sponges, it also filters it and it collects it, which is very beneficial for replenishing our groundwater system. When you do not have a wetland and you have a parking lot, it will allow just the water to hit the parking lot and run straight downstream. So you might be asking yourself what a floodplain is. Well, within the floodplain, we have a flood fringe, a floodway, and then your channel. So the channel is the highest velocity of the water that goes through your floodplain. Then from that, we have our floodway, which is associated with when fill comes into the floodway, it will bring the BFE or base flood elevation up by 1 foot. That is the limits of the floodway. So on our model here, the floodway is associated with this brown shaded color area right next to the channel. Then we have our flood fringe, which is associated by the next layer of green. And then we have the overview of the whole entire floodplain. So a flood event is actually when 2 or more properties or 2 or more acres are inundated with water. So now we will be demonstrating what the natural functions of a floodplain are. So some of the natural functions include a wetland, which allows the water to be stored during a rain event. So now we will be demonstrating what happens when water enters our floodplain. So we will be taking our large rainmaker here and getting our trusty bucket, dipping it into our water pail, and simulating a large rain event. As you can see, the water is going through our rainmaker into our wetland, and then the wetland will allow the water to filter through, and then once it reaches a capacity where it cannot hold any more water, it will slowly leave the wetland and travel all the way through our floodplain. And once the water is in our floodplain, it goes through the floodway, extends out through the flood fringe, and then all the way until it exits our floodplain. So with wetlands, there are 3 major types: a bog, a marsh, and a swamp. Each one has its own benefits to it in its ecosystem. And as you can see, there's still a lot of water still within our wetland. And that's why it is very beneficial for us to have wetlands, because it acts as Mother Nature's sponge. And now that we have demonstrated what a wetland does, we will move into what happens when you remove the wetland and build a parking lot. So now we will be removing our wetland and setting it aside to bring in our parking lot model. So we slide our parking lot model in, and they decide that they want to put in a building as well as some cars. So we have our building going in, and then we have customers coming in and parking in the parking lot as you normally would. So now you might ask yourself, what happens when it rains here versus when it rains in a wetland? So we are going to demonstrate that by taking our large rainmaker, getting our bucket, filling it with water, and demonstrating a large rain event. So as the rain comes in, it will inundate the whole property of this parking lot, and then it will rush all the way down through Walker's Creek, go through Broxton's Farm, and then into Burnsgetter Cove, completely inundating both two properties, which would be characterized as a flood event. So with a parking lot, as you saw, the rain came straight down and into the parking lot, did not have any time to saturate the parking lot, so it ran straight off into the floodplain. When this happens, a large volume of water moving down the floodway will inundate properties such as we have here with Broxton's Farm and Burnsgetter Cove. So that means it extended out through that flood fringe into the 1% annual chance area. Once the water has subsided, you can see that there's no water within Burnsgetter's Cove or Broxton's Farm. So now we had just seen what happens when you replace a wetland with a parking lot. Now the developer decided that there was a lot of flooding going on, so they are going to remove the parking lot and replace it with a retention pond. With a retention pond, it allows the water to come in and then slowly release once it gets to a certain level, similar to what happens in a wetland. So we insert our retention pond, and then they replace the parking lot back over top or nearby the retention pond. So now we will be taking a look at what happens when a large rain event comes into the area with a parking lot and a retention pond. Here comes the large rain again. As you can see, it's still with the parking lot. It doesn't allow the water to filtrate or filter through, and it just runs straight into this retention pond. However, now that there's the retention pond that is here, it allows the water to come up and slowly exit into our floodplain. And as you can see here, it doesn't go into the flood fringe nearly as much. So that means that Broxton's Farm and Burnsgetter's Cove are safe from this flood event, whereas before, with just the parking lot, they were not safe at all from the flood event. So now that we have demonstrated what happens when you have a large rain event with a parking lot and a retention pond in place, we're going to move into what happens when you develop in a floodplain. Broxton's Farm has decided to sell their property, and they are going to be turned into a subdivision. So we have the developer that comes in, and they build quite a few more houses here within the floodplain, which is actually in the flood fringe in this area. So now that they have developed within the floodplain, we will take a look at what happens when there is a rain event without the retention pond and just the parking lot again. So now we remove the retention pond, and we'll be setting it aside. Moving our parking lot back into place where the retention pond was. Sliding our rainmaker back in. Grabbing our trusty bucket of water here again. And once more simulating a large rain event. So again, as you can see, the water just runs straight down onto that parking lot and straight into the floodplain. This time, you can see that Broxton subdivision is now inundated with water, as well as Burnsgetter's Cove. They are completely underwater at this point. So with that, they are not happy that this just happened, and they do not want this to happen again at all. So to counteract this, Burnsgetter's Cove decided to elevate their properties, whereas the people in Broxton's subdivision are going to build a levee. So now we will be taking a look at what happens when you elevate your property as well as build a levee within the floodplain. So Burnsgetter's Cove, they are going to elevate their properties, whereas with Broxton's subdivision, they will be building a levee throughout their property. So we will take our makeshift levee here, place it into Broxton's subdivision. And then we already have the residents here at Burnskatter Cove. They have elevated all of their properties. So once again, we will simulate the large rain event, and we will be taking a look at what happens to the properties throughout the floodplain. There comes that large rain again, and this time it goes through the floodplain, does not affect anyone in Broxton's subdivision, and at Burnskatter Cove, the water comes up just enough, but it does not affect their property at all. So that means both of these properties and areas are not affected by this flood. So now we will be taking a look at what happens when you put the retention pond back in underneath this parking lot. So we'll slide our rainmaker out of the way, lift up our parking lot, and replace it back with our retention pond. So the reason that the retention pond is going back in because Burnskatter's Cove as well as Broxton's subdivision wanted to mitigate the chances of floodwater coming into their properties at all. So the retention pond will allow the water to slowly come in to the floodplain and then release much slower than it would, whereas there wouldn't be any retention pond at all. So we take our bucket again, get some water here, and produce a very large rainstorm. And again, the water cannot filter through the parking lot. It will run off into the retention pond, then collect there and slowly release into our floodplain. And now that it is slowly releasing into our floodplain, the people in Burnskatter's Cove as well as Broxton's subdivision are much happier that they don't have to deal with any of the high velocity flood waters that are coming through the floodway. So now that we have demonstrated what happens when a large rain event comes into the parking lot and into a retention pond and then slowly dissipates throughout the floodplain, the best course of action before any of this development happened would to be just leave our natural wetland in place. This allows for a lot greater chance of the water to store for a longer period of time, whereas the retention pond will release it faster than what it normally would in a wetland. So we will be sliding our rainmaker out of the way, removing our parking lot again, removing our retention pond, and reinstalling the wetland. Now once the wetland is in place, we'll slide our rainmaker back over and we'll simulate what happens with a large rain event. So now we are simulating a large rain event again, this time with a wetland in place. And with the wetland, you'll see that it does not allow the water to go nearly as close as it does with a retention pond in place. It allows the water to stay completely out of Burnskatter's Cove as well as the Broxton subdivision. So the water just barely gets into the 1% annual chance floodplain, but it does not completely inundate the properties at all. So in conclusion, whenever possible, we do not want to develop in a wetland. We always want to leave a wetland in place. If you have to develop in a floodplain, please get in contact with your local floodplain administrator.